When you truly understand the birth of Christ within you, something profound begins to unfold, not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet recognition. It is not announced by outer signs nor confirmed by human authority. It is felt as a deep inner knowing that the life you have been seeking has always been present, waiting to be recognized rather than achieved. This understanding does not come through intellect or belief alone, but through an inner awakening where truth reveals itself gently, yet unmistakably. The birth of Christ as an inner, living realization rather than a historical memory points to a shift in how spiritual truth is understood and experienced. For many, the idea of Christ is held as an event anchored in time, honored through tradition, ceremony, and remembrance. While this historical reverence has meaning, it often keeps the experience external, something to admire rather than something to live. When the birth of Christ is understood inwardly, it moves from being a story about the past to a reality unfolding in present consciousness. It becomes less about what happened once and more about what is happening now within the depth of one's own awareness. This inner realization begins when the individual stops looking outward for proof of divine presence and becomes receptive to it within. Instead of asking how God acted long ago, the question subtly shifts to how divine life is expressing itself in this very moment. This does not deny history, but it transcends dependence on it. The Christ is no longer perceived as distant or unreachable, but as the very animating presence behind thought, breath, intuition, and awareness. What was once admired from afar becomes intimate and immediate. As this understanding grows, spirituality moves away from imitation and toward realization. Rather than trying to live up to an idealized figure, the individual becomes aware of the same divine essence stirring within their own being. This awareness does not announce itself dramatically. It often appears as a quiet certainty, a gentle illumination that changes perception from the inside out. Life begins to feel guided rather than random, supported rather than burdensome, meaningful rather than mechanical. Viewing the birth of Christ as a living reality also changes the role of belief. Belief is no longer something held in the mind, but something verified through experience. Instead of affirming truths intellectually, one begins to sense truth as a presence that steadies, comforts, and clarifies. This presence does not require constant reinforcement. It reveals itself naturally when the mind becomes still enough to perceive it. In this stillness, the individual recognizes that divine life is not entering them from outside, but is being unveiled from within. This realization carries profound implications for identity. When Christ is seen as an inward birth, identity gradually shifts from being based on personality, history, and circumstance to being rooted in spiritual consciousness. The individual begins to sense that they are not merely a body or a collection of experiences, but an expression of a greater life. This does not remove human traits or responsibilities, but it places them within a larger, more harmonious context. Fear and insecurity lose some of their authority because they no longer define the core of being. Understanding Christ inwardly also dissolves the sense of spiritual hierarchy. No one is closer to God than another, and no one is excluded from divine life. The same presence that awakened in the Christ is available to all, not as a reward, but as an inherent reality. This realization brings humility without diminishment and confidence without arrogance. It fosters a natural reverence for life, not because it is commanded, but because the sacred is recognized everywhere. As the birth of Christ is lived rather than remembered, daily life becomes the arena of spiritual expression. Ordinary moments take on quiet significance, and simple acts are infused with meaning. Guidance arises not from rigid rules, but from inner awareness. Compassion flows more freely because it is no longer practiced as an obligation, but experienced as a natural recognition of shared divine life. The Christ within is not something to be celebrated once a year, but something to be discovered again and again in the unfolding of consciousness itself. Silence, stillness, and receptivity as the doorway to spiritual awakening point to an inner posture rather than an outer practice. Spiritual realization does not arrive through accumulation of knowledge, constant effort, or emotional intensity, but through a willingness to become inwardly quiet. The mind is often filled with commentary, expectation, fear, and desire, and this constant movement leaves little space for deeper awareness to emerge. When silence is embraced, not as absence but as presence, consciousness begins to settle into its natural depth, where truth is already waiting to be recognized. Stillness is not the suppression of thought, but the relaxation of resistance. It is the moment when the individual stops struggling to control life and allows awareness to rest in being. In this state, the compulsive need to analyze, judge, and anticipate begins to soften. The mind becomes less occupied with past and future and more available to the immediacy of now. This availability is essential because spiritual awakening does not occur in memory or imagination, but in direct awareness. Stillness creates the inner environment where perception can shift from surface appearances to underlying reality. Receptivity follows naturally from stillness. When the personal sense of doing gives way to openness, consciousness becomes like fertile ground. There is no forcing, no reaching, no demand for results. Instead, there is a quiet listening, an inner attention that is alert yet relaxed. In this receptive state, insight arises spontaneously, not as something constructed, but as something revealed. Guidance, clarity, and peace are not pulled into awareness. They surface when the mind stops obstructing them. Silence plays a crucial role because divine reality does not communicate through noise. It is subtle, gentle, and easily overshadowed by mental activity. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of inner argument and self-assertion. In silence, the individual ceases to tell life what it should be and becomes willing to see what is. This willingness allows a deeper intelligence to be felt, an intelligence that does not speak in words but in knowing. It is recognized as a sense of rightness, a calm assurance that does not need explanation. As silence and stillness become familiar, trust begins to replace effort. The individual realizes that awakening is not something to be achieved, but something to be allowed. The personal will no longer feel solely responsible for shaping outcomes. There is a growing sense that life is guided from within by a wisdom greater than personal understanding. This recognition brings relief, not passivity, but a different quality of action. Actions arise from clarity rather than anxiety, from intuition rather than compulsion. In receptivity, the ego loosens its grip without being attacked or denied. There is no need to battle the sense of self. It naturally becomes transparent in the presence of awareness. The individual begins to sense that their true nature is not the stream of thoughts, but the consciousness in which thoughts appear. This shift in identification is subtle yet transformative. It brings a sense of spaciousness, as though life is being lived from a deeper center rather than from the surface of reaction. Over time, silence, stillness, and receptivity cease to be occasional states and begin to inform daily living. One listens more deeply, speaks more gently, and responds rather than reacts. Challenges are met with inner pause instead of immediate resistance. In that pause, a different order of intelligence becomes accessible and life reveals itself not as a problem to be solved, but as a presence to be experienced. Spiritual awakening unfolds not through dramatic effort, but through the quiet surrender that allows truth to make itself known within awareness itself. The shift from personal effort to divine unfoldment within consciousness represents a fundamental change in how life is approached and understood. Much of human experience is driven by the belief that progress, safety, and fulfillment depend primarily on individual effort. This belief creates a constant sense of responsibility where one feels personally tasked with managing outcomes, correcting circumstances, and securing the future. While effort has its place on the practical level, relying on it as the source of life's harmony often leads to strain, anxiety, and exhaustion. Spiritual awakening introduces a different basis for living, one that does not begin with doing, but with being. This shift begins when the individual becomes aware that personal effort alone cannot produce inner peace or lasting fulfillment. No amount of planning or striving can resolve the deeper sense of incompleteness that arises from identifying solely with the personal self. In moments of honest recognition, there is a quiet admission that something greater than personal will is required. This recognition is not defeat. It is the opening through which divine unfoldment becomes possible. When the pressure to make life work relaxes, consciousness becomes available to a deeper intelligence already present within. Divine unfoldment is not an external intervention, but an inner revelation. It does not arrive as something added to consciousness, but as something uncovered when resistance subsides. As personal effort yields, awareness begins to sense a natural order operating beneath the surface of events. This order is not chaotic or arbitrary. It carries an inherent intelligence that knows how to express harmony, guidance, and resolution. The individual begins to feel that life is not pushing against them, but moving through them with purpose. Letting go of excessive personal effort does not mean inactivity or indifference. Action continues, but its source changes. Instead of being driven by fear, ambition, or the need for control, action flows from inner clarity. Decisions arise more intuitively, often accompanied by a sense of ease rather than pressure. There is less second guessing and more trust in the unfolding moment. This trust is not blind belief, it is grounded in repeated experience of being guided when one stops forcing outcomes. As divine unfoldment becomes more apparent, the sense of isolation begins to dissolve. The individual no longer feels like a separate entity struggling against circumstances. There is a growing awareness of being part of a larger movement of life, supported by a wisdom that is not personal yet intimately present. This awareness softens self-judgment and reduces the constant evaluation of success and failure. Life is seen as a process of expression rather than a test of worth. This shift also transforms the experience of challenges. Difficulties are no longer interpreted solely as obstacles to overcome through sheer effort. They are approached with a willingness to pause and listen inwardly. In that pause, insight often arises, revealing responses that are more effective than forceful action. Problems begin to lose their power to create fear because they are no longer faced alone. There is an inner assurance that resolution does not depend entirely on personal capacity. Over time, living from divine unfoldment fosters humility without weakness and confidence without strain. The individual becomes less concerned with asserting control and more attentive to inner direction. There is a sense of cooperation with life rather than opposition to it. This cooperation does not eliminate responsibility, but it places responsibility within a larger context where effort is balanced by trust. Life is no longer carried as a burden on the shoulders of the personal self, but allowed to unfold from a deeper source within consciousness itself. The dissolving of fear, lack, and separation through inner illumination occurs as consciousness awakens to a deeper sense of reality than appearances suggest. Fear, lack, and separation do not originate in divine truth. They arise from a limited perception of self as isolated, vulnerable, and dependent on external conditions for security and fulfillment. When awareness is centered solely in the personal sense of identity, life appears uncertain, resources seem scarce, and others feel separate or threatening. Inner illumination begins to dissolve these perceptions not by fighting them, but by revealing their unreality in the light of deeper understanding. Fear diminishes as the individual recognizes an inner presence that remains untouched by circumstances. This recognition does not deny challenges, but it removes the belief that challenges have ultimate power. As illumination dawns, fear is seen as a response to imagined separation from source rather than an accurate assessment of reality. There is a growing sense that life is not hostile or random, but intelligently sustained. This awareness brings calm, not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because the foundation of being is felt to be secure. Lack dissolves in a similar way. The belief in lack stems from identifying supply as external and limited, something to be acquired, protected, or competed for. Inner illumination shifts this perception by revealing supply as an expression of an inexhaustible source within consciousness itself. As this understanding deepens, the individual no longer feels driven by constant need or anxiety about the future. There is a quiet assurance that what is truly required for each moment is already present or will appear as needed. This assurance changes the relationship with material conditions, reducing desperation and fostering gratitude. Separation is perhaps the most deeply rooted illusion, and its dissolution brings profound transformation. Inner illumination reveals that the sense of being cut off from others, from life, or from the divine is a misunderstanding of identity. As consciousness awakens, the individual begins to sense a shared life flowing through all forms. This does not erase individuality, but it places individuality within a larger unity. Others are no longer perceived primarily as competitors, obstacles, or strangers, but as expressions of the same underlying presence. As fear, lack, and separation loosen their hold, the emotional landscape of life begins to change. Anxiety gives way to peace, striving softens into trust, and loneliness is replaced by quiet belonging. These changes do not occur through positive thinking or denial, but through a shift in perception. Inner illumination acts like light entering a dark room, not arguing with the darkness, but making it irrelevant. The old patterns lose their authority simply because they are no longer believed at the deepest level. This illumination also affects how situations are interpreted. Events that once triggered fear or defensiveness are met with greater composure. There is an inner pause before reaction, allowing clarity to emerge. In that pause, responses arise that are more compassionate and less driven by self-protection. Life feels less like a series of threats and more like a continuous unfolding of meaning. As this process continues, the individual discovers that peace is not something to be achieved, but something uncovered. Fear, lack, and separation are not enemies to be conquered, but shadows cast by misunderstanding. When consciousness is illuminated from within, these shadows fade naturally. What remains is a quiet confidence in life, a sense of sufficiency that does not depend on circumstances, and an awareness of unity that transforms how one lives, relates, and perceives the world from the inside out. Living from spiritual identity instead of human identity involves a profound reorientation of how one understands selfhood. Human identity is largely formed through name, history, roles, achievements, failures, and the perceptions of others. It is shaped by memory and sustained by comparison, constantly measuring itself against external standards. While this identity is functional for navigating the world, it is inherently unstable because it depends on changing conditions. Spiritual identity emerges when consciousness recognizes itself as something deeper than these fluctuating definitions, as an expression of a life that is timeless, whole, and not subject to personal history. This shift begins when attention turns inward and becomes aware of the observer behind experience. Thoughts, emotions, and roles are seen as movements within awareness rather than as the essence of being. This recognition gently loosens attachment to personal narratives. One may still remember the past and plan for the future, but these no longer define the core sense of self. Identity becomes rooted in being rather than becoming. There is a growing sense of presence that remains consistent regardless of circumstances, bringing stability where there was once inner tension. Living from spiritual identity changes how challenges are experienced. When identity is human-centered, difficulties are often taken personally, interpreted as threats to self-worth or security. From a spiritual standpoint, challenges are encountered within a larger field of meaning. They are not denied, but they no longer determine identity. This perspective allows one to engage with life more freely, without the constant fear of loss or failure. There is an inner resilience that comes not from toughness, but from detachment from outcomes. Relationships are also transformed through this shift. When identity is rooted in the human sense, interactions are often driven by need, expectation, and the desire for validation. Living from spiritual identity introduces a different quality of connection. One relates from fullness rather than lack, from recognition rather than demand. Others are seen not merely as personalities, but as expressions of the same underlying life. This perception fosters respect, patience, and compassion without effort, as understanding replaces judgment. Decision-making takes on a new character as well. Instead of being driven solely by ambition, fear, or social conditioning, choices arise from inner alignment. There is a sense of being guided by an intelligence that does not argue or rush. This guidance is subtle yet reliable, offering clarity in moments where the mind might otherwise be conflicted. Actions feel less forced and more appropriate to the moment, as though life is moving in harmony rather than resistance. Living from spiritual identity also reshapes the experience of success and failure. Achievements are appreciated but not clung to, and setbacks are met without self-condemnation. Worth is no longer measured by productivity or approval. There is a quiet dignity in simply being, a sense that existence itself is meaningful. This understanding frees energy that was previously consumed by self-concern, allowing creativity and service to flow more naturally. As spiritual identity becomes more established, life is lived with greater simplicity and depth. There is less need to defend an image or maintain control. Joy arises from presence rather than possession, and peace is felt as an inner constant rather than a temporary state. The human self continues to function, but it is no longer the center of experience. It becomes an instrument through which a deeper life expresses itself, bringing a sense of authenticity and quiet fulfillment into everyday living itself. The outward transformation of life, when inner Christ awareness is realized, is not the result of deliberate attempts to change circumstances, but the natural expression of a shift that has already taken place within consciousness. When inner awareness aligns with a deeper spiritual reality, the outer patterns of life begin to reflect that alignment in subtle yet meaningful ways. This transformation is not dramatic or forced. It unfolds organically as perception, intention, and response are reshaped from within. As inner Christ awareness becomes established, the way one meets daily life changes. Situations that once triggered anxiety, defensiveness, or impatience are approached with greater calm and clarity. This change in inner response alters outcomes because life is no longer met from fear or resistance. Interactions become less reactive and more harmonious, and this shift often leads to improved relationships without conscious effort to fix them. Others sense the difference in presence, responding to the quiet confidence and peace that replace urgency and strain. Work and activity are also transformed through this awareness. Effort is no longer driven by the need to prove worth or secure identity. Action flows from a sense of purpose rather than pressure. This often results in greater effectiveness, not because one is trying harder, but because attention is clearer and motivation is aligned. Opportunities appear more naturally and decisions feel more timely. Even when challenges arise, they are handled with discernment rather than overwhelm, allowing progress without exhaustion. Material conditions often reflect this inner change as well. When fear and lack no longer dominate consciousness, the relationship with resources becomes more balanced. One is neither grasping nor neglectful, but attentive and receptive. Needs tend to be met in appropriate ways, sometimes through unexpected channels. This does not imply constant abundance in a material sense, but it does bring a sense of sufficiency and trust that reduces struggle. Life feels supported rather than adversarial. Health and well-being can also be influenced by inner Christ awareness. As tension, fear, and inner conflict diminish, the body often responds with greater ease and balance. While physical conditions may still require attention, they are no longer experienced as isolated problems disconnected from consciousness. There is a sense of cooperation with the body rather than opposition to it. This cooperative relationship fosters patience and compassion toward oneself, which in turn supports overall well-being. Creativity and expression are renewed through this inner realization. When consciousness is no longer preoccupied with self-protection or comparison, creative impulses flow more freely. Expression becomes authentic rather than strategic. Whether in work, relationships, or simple daily activities, there is a sense of life expressing itself through individual form. This brings freshness to routine and meaning to ordinary moments. As inner Christ awareness deepens, life takes on a quality of coherence. Events are no longer seen as disconnected or random, but as part of an unfolding pattern guided by deeper intelligence. Even difficulties are approached with trust that something meaningful is at work beyond immediate appearances. This trust does not remove responsibility, but it removes despair. One acts where action is required and rests where waiting is appropriate. The outward transformation of life ultimately reflects an inward alignment with truth. As consciousness changes, experience follows. Life becomes less about managing problems and more about participating in a living process that carries its own wisdom. The world may look the same on the surface, but it is encountered from a different center where peace, clarity, and purpose quietly shape each moment as it unfolds through everyday experience itself. When the birth of Christ is understood as an inner reality, the entire orientation of life shifts from seeking to recognizing, from striving to allowing. What once appeared distant and symbolic is revealed as an ever-present truth unfolding within consciousness itself. Through silence, stillness, and receptivity, awareness opens to a divine movement that does not need personal force to sustain it. Fear, lack, and separation lose their authority as inner illumination reveals a deeper foundation of being, one that is whole, sufficient, and unified. Living from this awareness transforms identity, no longer anchoring life in fragile human definitions, but in a spiritual presence that remains steady amid change. From this inner alignment, outer life naturally reflects harmony, clarity, and purpose without struggle. Relationships soften, actions become guided, and circumstances respond to the consciousness from which they are met. The realization of Christ within is not an escape from life, but the discovery of life's true source, quietly expressing itself through every thought, act, and moment of awareness as lived experience.